Hi guys, this video is from Aydin Paladin. Now Aydin and I go way back. I've known her since almost the start of my career on YouTube. And she's a great person. She actually gave me a huge boost when my channel was a baby channel. And I am so happy to return the favor. Aydin produces just extraordinary content. She is a social scientist with a PhD who doesn't sell the woke progressive agenda. On the contrary, she tends to be very fact-based and very hard in her analysis of issues. I think that she's just a terrific content creator. I highly recommend her. I'm showing you this this little preview of the kind of material that she does, and I hope that you enjoy it. And if you do enjoy it, please go and subscribe to her channel. The link is in the description below, because you are going to get something really, really worthwhile. So without further ado, here's Aydin Paladin.
Greetings friends, Aydin Paladin here, and today, Coach has graciously invited me onto his channel to let me talk a little bit about some of my favorite topics: statistics, social science, and society. We often hear that there is a wage gap between men and women, and looking at the basic statistics, well, it seems unquestionably true. Women do, in fact, earn less than men on average when we look at these just basic raw data. Now, while I could illustrate to you that plenty of other data, as seen here in Clevin Landis and Sogard 2018, indicate that the majority, over 80% of this residual wage gap, is due to women taking time off to care for their children, and that the result of a push towards gender equality has caused both men and women to earn less over time, coalescing towards a lowered mean of earnings and forcing both sexes to work more for less pay. We cannot deny that there is still a residual mean difference in earnings parity between the sexes of about 10%, even in millennials and Gen Z, which tend to have the lowest discrepancy in earnings between the sexes in all of modernity. Despite the great supposed strides of the feminist movement, which again has produced a culture in which both men and women earn less and are both forced to work more and thus require women spend time away from their children, we still often hear that this existing difference in mean earnings is proof of a wage gap, and that this wage gap is a product of sexism, a so-called broken rung. A recent article from Andy Kramer,
"If only there were a horrible name that I could call you that would make you as angry as I am,"
published in Forbes, explicates this perspective in full, indicating that women continually lag behind men in positions of authority and managerialism, and assigning this difference to bigotry and gender preference on the part of men for their fellow man in opposition to women in the workplace. Now, again, of course, when we go back and look at some of the actual data, we can see that this is because women tend to remain outside of the workplace after having children, or at most return part-time for decades until said children have left the home. And even at that point, they tend to work fewer hours than their male counterparts, who in turn tend to see an increase in earnings and raises after having children. For example, fathers, at least in the UK, earn an average of 21% more than non-fathers, and fathers are consistently suggested for higher wages and promotions than non-fathers are, as we can see in data from Carell, Bernard, and Pike 2007. Well, this seems to explain the wage gap, right? Wrong, at least according to the likes of Miss Kramer. It's all a result of gender bias. After all, a report she cites from leanin.org concludes the biggest obstacle that women face in reaching senior leadership is at the first step up to manager. Fixing this broken rung is the key to achieving parity. Ignoring all the statistics and explications I've already provided, just for the sake of a little mental exercise, we must still ask, is it true that men are keeping women down and out of managerial positions due to gender preference for their fellow man? Andy Kramer claims that the reason is in-group gender bias, that men are unlikely to promote women into positions of power or to hire them at all. However, is there any actual further research to support Ms. Kramer's claims? To answer this question, we first have to look at the concept of in-group gender preference or bias. And when we start to do so, well, quickly, it's not looking so hot for Ms. Kramer's assertions, as research has long indicated that women tend to have a preference for other women, but men have no preference for other men, as we can see in research from Rudman and Goodwin 2004, who conducted 4 experiments regarding gender preference in men and women. In the first study, they found only women tended to have an implicit inherent preference for their own sex. In essence, the results of this study indicated that women tended to believe, if I am good and I am female, females are good. Whereas men could be characterized as thinking in contrast, even if I am good and I am male, men are not necessarily good. A second study replicated these findings, with women preferring women more than men preferred men, but also found that both genders had a strong implicit preference for mothers over fathers. A third study indicated that this preference was, in part, a perception in both men and women that men were more threatening and women more caring and kind, resulting in both sexes viewing women more positively. Finally, a fourth experiment indicated that people who were more sexually experienced, if you catch my drift, also tended to have an implicit preference for women over men, across both of the sexes. While I have qualms with these studies due to their use of the implicit associations test, which is a measure of heuristics more so than anything else, that's a complicated topic for another video. In short, it's just not a very good way of measuring what people actually prefer, but luckily it's not the only study we can look to when considering in-group gender preference, particularly when it concerns occupations, wherein we so often hear that men are only supporting the hiring of other men. There is, after all, some evidence for that outside of the laboratory and going into the actual workplace. For example, Brown et al. 2016 found that the extent of gender preference for referring individuals of the same gender in mid-level corporations between the years of 2000 and 2011 indicated that 63% of all referrals to positions were for people of the same gender. The problem here, though, is that Brown's data do not delineate specifically between how many of these referrals were women referring women and how many of them were men referring men, but instead only give us a general percentage. Other studies, however, have separated the genders, as we can see in data from a US call center from Fernandez and Sosa 2005. They found that 75% of referrals by female employees were for other women. In contrast, only 44% of referrals by male workers were for other men. There was a distinct preference in women to refer employees of the same sex that simply was not present in men. They also found that men were slightly more likely to be hired when they were referred by a woman, and women were slightly more likely to be hired when referred by a man. It seems then that based on women's preference for other women, and given that there is a gender disparity in referring others for positions within the workplace, that there's actually pretty good reason to believe it's women, not men, who tend to promote themselves, rather than men promoting other men and keeping women down and out. To understand this further, though, let's look at a brand new study hot off the presses. Bruno and Pertile, 2020, and don't worry, I'm not time traveling from the future to bring you this study, it just hasn't been physically published yet. That's how fresh it is.
Mentos, the fresh maker.
Designed an experiment to assess whether men were more likely to recommend other men over women for positions of financial reward. Students at a French business school were separated into referees and referers, and 4 different conditions. In the competitive condition, referers were paid more, up to a maximum of €6 based on their performance on a general common knowledge test against and in competition with their referee. For this reason, it was in the greatest financial interest of the referer to select a referee that they felt they could easily best in this task. In the collaborative condition, the referer's payoff was equal to their own performance plus the performance of the referee, divided by 2, meaning that it was in the referer's best financial interest to select the most competent person to complete this knowledge test. Additionally, the amount of information available to the referers was manipulated. In the low information condition, referers were only aware of the age, desired specialization within the business school, year of study, and most importantly for this particular experiment, the sex of the potential referees. In contrast, in the high information condition, the referers were also told how well the various referees had performed on a pretest of common knowledge. In order to get the most money then, participants in the competitive condition would be best suited by selecting a student who had performed poorly on the pretest. However, in the low information condition, referers were only aware of the age, area of study, status in the program, and gender of their potential referees. If the assertions of Ms. Kramer are accurate, and men are responsible for keeping women out of positions of power due to in-group preference, we would expect men to prefer other men, particularly in the collaborative condition, and only potentially prefer women in the competitive condition if they'd prefer them at all, thinking that women are weaker and more easily bested in the knowledge task. But what did the researchers actually find? It's quickly evident when we look at the data, no, men do not actually prefer to recommend other men, even when they have more to gain were they to expect their fellow men to be better partners in a collaborative environment, and women to be better partners in a competitive environment that they could dominate, wherein it made the most financial sense to choose a weaker referee. Women were nearly 10% more likely to choose another woman when they had no other information to go on than basic demographic data, than men were to choose another man. When participants were aware of how well the referees had performed on the pretest, this increased to a 12% disparity, with women still being much more likely to choose another female competitor than men to choose a male competitor. Well, obviously, this is some manifestation of the very problem of the broken rung that Ms. Kramer describes, right? Men are just more likely to choose women to compete against because they view them as weaker. Except when we look at the collaborative condition, similar results were forwarded. When participants had nothing to go on beyond gender and other demographic variables, women were nearly 13% more likely to choose another woman to collaborate with than men were to choose another man. This difference in scores was highest across all of the conditions. While the differences were smallest between men and women's preference when the referer had information about the referee's pre-test scores in the collaborative test, women consistently tended to prefer choosing a female collaborator than men preferred a male collaborative partner. This means that women consistently tended to prefer to refer other women to both work with and work against. But how does this compare to the potential financial gains that participants received? After all, perhaps it was just the case that the other women were selecting as partners were just better partners either for earning more in a competitive or collaborative environment respectively, and really, ultimately, sex just had nothing to do with it. Well, luckily for us, the researchers took that possibility into account. For competitive environments, women were 9% more likely to choose the worst option for themselves, referring another woman who was a strong match against them. In contrast, in the collaborative condition, women were slightly better at choosing a well-performing partner than men were, selecting the absolute best match in 6% more cases than men, while men were slightly less than 4% more likely to choose the worst match for themselves in the collaborative case. When we assess what these data indicate, it seems that women will prefer to support other women even to their own potential detriment, while men seem to choose to refer whoever they think is best for them, even if they are often wrong, regardless of the sex of the referral. Preferring same-sex referrals was significantly greater in all women across all conditions, regardless of whether or not that preference resulted in greater financial gain for the woman referrer. As we've seen, women do tend to prefer other women, but when it concerns men, well, they're generally disinterested in the sex of the person they are either competing with or collaborating with in comparison to the so-called fairer sex. The only time men even approached women's preference for same-sex referrals was when they thought they would be working collaboratively together and when they were aware of the pre-test scores of other men. In other words, men have very little innate gender bias compared to women, and instead tend to judge their competitors and collaborators based more on information than on pure demography. As the robustness checks indicate, being the same gender was only important for women referrers, both in the collaborative and the competitive conditions. For men, the only group effect that was present was in the cooperative task, in that men were slightly more likely to choose a partner from their same class cohort. The results of this study indicate that women, and only women, have an implicit gender bias towards others of the same sex, even when it comes to positions involving money and earnings. When we apply these findings to the workplace in general, there is no strong evidence that men actively try to keep women out of positions in managerialism or power, whether these positions be competitive or cooperative. Instead, quite the opposite is true, in that when women have positions of power, they will always, at least according to these data, and even potentially to their own detriment, be prone to select other women to work with and against. Not only do these data and the aforementioned studies illustrate why the residual wage gap is not a product of supposed male discrimination against women, it actually shows us that when women do find themselves in places of power, they will mostly seek to elevate other women, even when it does nothing to serve their own well-being. Men instead are focused seemingly on fairness, challenge, and competition, choosing more frequently the weakest partner to compete against, but also being less adept at selecting a collaborative partner to work with on a project. Men lack the in-group preference that women possess, beyond a slight preference for those in their same academic cohort, perhaps seeing a sense of camaraderie in similar background rather than camaraderie of gender. While this is just one novel study, it provides us with some good evidence that the supposed old boys network club that we often hear spake of as representative of oppressive patriarchy is simply not the case in reality. Men seemingly want to do well for themselves, to win, to succeed as an individual, while women want the gender, the sex to do well. They want the group to be uplifted, no matter how illogical it may be for the individual. Thus, the next time you hear about how women are kept out of the workplace by men, consider citing some of these studies. For a growing plethora of research indicates consistently that it's women, not men, who have a strong gendered in-group preference towards those of the same sex. Of course, much more research need be done, with samples larger than the 175 French students assessed by Bugnon-Pachelet, and in more real-world environments with actual workplaces and with more external validity. However, as it stands, these data do dunk on the claims of the likes of Ms. Kramer, and should similarly provide a refutation for those who claim that men are simply sexist, and the reasons for which women make less than men and remain in mostly non-managerial positions is one of bigotry and discrimination. The obvious alternative hypothesis, supported by the data, is that women tend to leave the workplace to have children and to have a family, and remain employed only part-time even as their children are grown. Of course, women should feel no shame for this, because it's simply a biological reality that women are the ones who gestate and produce children. But what these data indicate is that other women give their fellow females potentially a massive boost in the workplace, indicating further that the remaining disparity between men and women in earnings is not due to male discrimination, but rather due to women's own life choices. Quite normal life choices to be wives and mothers rather than full-time workers. And ultimately, they're probably better off and happier in doing so. After all, as a study from Perigcello, Hutchinson, and Hopfinger 2008 indicates, women who work full-time without being mothers or wives were quite unsatisfied with the way that they spent their time, wanting both more time for themselves and more time with a potential partner than working moms and full-time homemakers said that they felt. Just a little bit to think about when women insist that they are fulfilled solely by careers and don't need no man. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and a big thank you to Coach Red Pill for hosting me on his channel. If you liked it and are interested in learning more about statistics, social sciences, and how it all relates to current topics in politics and society, I think you might find some more stuff to enjoy over on my channel as well. Thanks again for having me on, Coach, and as always, Altana Volt.